Stanford University.
Lauren, where's Lauren?
Yes. Hey.
Okay, we're on. Apologies for the late start. We're still fighting some audio difficulties, but I thought I would go ahead and start the introduction. So, boo! Happy Halloween to everybody, and welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. Next week, we are going to have Mary Ringel Morris, who's at Microsoft Research, and some of you may know because she was a graduate student here, did her PhD, finished a couple years ago. At that time, she was working on tabletop interfaces, which of course now Microsoft is commercializing. But one of the projects that she's been working on at Microsoft, which she'll be talking about, is collaborative web browsing. So we think of web browsing as a kind of single-person activity. I'm sitting there trying to look for stuff, and maybe I'll mail somebody a URL now and then. But what does it really mean to be working as a group collaboratively, developing a search, finding information on the web? And she's built some interesting tools and done some interesting studies about that. So that's next week, Mary Morris. Today's speaker, are we any better, or are we still fighting it?
No, we're still waiting. Yep.
Okay.
Someone have a set of fairly high-powered speakers?
So,
in case
could
we
one of you
can't
guys
get
do me a
the
favor,
phone?
Nima, or in my office, just to steal the speakers off of my workstation?
Otherwise, I'll be obliged to act out all the parts in the videos.
So today's speaker is Justine Cassell, and we have special privileges here of having her around campus for the whole year. She's normally at Northwestern University, and she's now for the year.
Sorry, that's going to keep happening as we keep trying to sound.
Center for Audio.
Yeah, right. If
She's
only.
At the Center for Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, doing research, getting a sabbatical, getting away from all the pressures of teaching for a year, which is a great thing that this center provides. And her research over the years has pursued a very interesting methodology, which is she started off studying how people use things like gestures. She actually has her original degree in linguistics. And then got interested in how would it be if you built artificial characters who did things like gesturing. And then realized that by building these artificial characters, you had a wonderful window into the social side of human interaction. Because when a person interacts with one of these characters, you can call out different bits of behavior. You can study with a kind of a microscope how people respond to different physical instantiations. So she's done a number of studies over the years of different kinds in which she's using virtual characters that she and her students have constructed to look at different aspects of human social behavior and functioning. And that's what she'll be talking about today, and we may even be able to hear some of the studies.
Right, exactly. So this is a, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, good. This is a funny kind of a talk. It's a kind of a meta talk because I'm going to be making a claim about the field of HCI as opposed to particular strands of HCI or particular projects within HCI. I'm going to try and make a claim that I hope will be provocative in this context, which is that, as is often said on the Stanford campus, enlightened trial and error may outperform the planning of flawless intellect. Really, what that means is get your social science together with your engineering. And that although that's stated as a claim about design, I'm going to say that enlightened trial and error really means look closely at humans using a broad range of tools taken from the social sciences and developed into social theories. So I think that's the right way to do things. but I don't think it's the way it's always done in HCI. For example, if you look at most HCI classes, Introduction to HCI, curricula in HCI, how to design a user study usually turns up somewhere in week 10 or 12. Why is it so late in the process? If we're so interested in designing for people, why isn't people lesson number 1? So I'm going to argue that we want to be looking at people, shadowing them, taking apart their behavior, their desires, their goals, their relationships, before we sit down at a desk to implement. And then again, and then again, and then again, throughout the process of implementation. So why am I giving this talk today? Because, oh good, yep, let's do that. And I wonder why I never got into audio interfaces.
There's also a connection between the left and the right. So.
Okay, you do that, and I'll plug this in. What's the, okay, and what's the USB port for? Does this do anything? No, okay.
Oh, that's
no. Okay, that's something else. Great, let's just try this before we go any further. Okay, great. You might need to scoot forward a little bit, but at least you'll be able to hear it. Okay. So why give this talk now? Well, over the last 2 years, I've been working very hard to launch a new PhD program and a new center called the Center and the PhD program in Technology and Social Behavior. That's led me to think a lot about the relationship between technology and social behavior, and it's led me to read a lot about other programs in the same area. And what I notice is that while there are increasing numbers of programs in HCI, or things that might be kind of HCI, like human-centered computing or informatics, despite their stated claim to bring together social science and engineering, there's really usually a wall between them. Social science is often the icing on the cake, the thing you do to make your paper accepted to HCI, because everybody knows you need a social theory to make your technology pass. Or vice versa, engineering is that macho move to make it clear that you're really a geek, so that your papers will be accepted in computer science conferences. Why isn't there an equality between those two approaches and those two methodologies? Well, the argument depends critically, I think, on what social science is and what engineering is. So I'm going to come back to this in a couple of seconds, but first I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by using the social sciences in the design of technology. And this is why we had to get these speakers. These are part of a research project we've been doing over the last year and a half, looking at designing toys to help shy children join play, and designing toys that can be used as assessment tools for social skills deficits and social skills disorders, such as children with autism spectrum disorder. So we spend our time, lucky us, sitting in the Eagles and the Hawks classroom, that is the 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds respectively, of our local YMCA as they play. And we just set up cameras and get out of there. And these are the kinds of things we see. Yeah. Whoops. Let's try that again. So here's a kid playing alone, and another kid comes up.
I don't know how to build ship. I know how. I can. Oh my God! Any puzzle. I know how to do this.
Okay. So this is a kind of play we often see at this age. These two kids are talking a lot about the task that they're both carrying out. Are they doing a lot of collaboration in that task? No, not a tremendous amount. It's what might be called parallel play. Let me show you another example or two. This is a good, listen carefully.
Isaiah, I thought you were playing with me. Why did I play with them? Because she wants.
Okay, so the kid who stood up said, Isaiah, I thought you were playing with me. And the other little kid who was playing with somebody else on the other side of the classroom came over, bringing the person that he was playing with him, and all four of them joined into building with these Duplo blocks. One last one. Eleanor is not interested.
Just for a few minutes, and then I can send you to one of the areas that are already have people playing.
There's a garden.
Shira and Ella.
Okay, I just wanted you to see that again. So these are great examples. This happens probably 10 times a minute. This kind of bid to join, invitation to join, attempt to join, refusal to join. This is what kids spend their lives learning how to do. It's what they spend their time doing. Why is it in the slightest interesting for us? It's interesting for us because it tells us about the nature of the boundaries of play. A lot of us design toys for children, interactive environments for children, narrative, immersive environments. Where do we get our notion of the boundaries of those environments? How do we understand how children or adults, for that matter, are going to go into them or out of them? I'm saying that we need to do that by watching them in the wild, as it were. Now, I'm going to tell you right away what my takeaway points are. You pretty much know by now, but I figure if you want to do something else, like, use Facebook or chat, you could do that, and then you could come back and ask an intelligent sounding question because you'll have had the takeaway points. So the takeaway points are going to be that in the field of HCI, there has been a false dichotomy between knowledge and artifacts, where knowledge is supposed to be the output of science and artifacts are supposed to be the output of engineering. There has been a false dichotomy, and this comes from Terry's paper, between the rationalistic and the constructivist. And Terry's paper is a beautiful description of what's happened through history. But I think it's because of what happened through history that it was true when he wrote it, and it may not be true anymore. And that to reunite artifacts and science, rationalistic and constructivist approaches, we need to update our understanding of what science is, particularly, what artifacts are also, but mostly what science is. We need to replace a cognitive psychology that was there at the birth of HCI, but that may no longer be relevant to our goals in HCI. In particular, we need to replace the cognitive psychology goals of users or conception of users, units of analysis, human capabilities, domains of interest, and technology. The rest is all fine if there is anything left. And that a new HCI made of these can both rely on and produce knowledge of humans as well as design of technologies and artifacts. And I'm going back to history because I think it's interesting to reflect where this uneasy tension came from. And I think it came from the earliest places where we can find a description of the intersection between psychology and computer science. Lick, for example, Lickletter, who was really talking about the augmentation of humans, but it's been taken as an argument for HCI. He said that the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. So hold that in mind. Likewise, Herb Simon wrote, and this is actually from his memoir of Newell, of Alan Newell, and it's a lovely piece in the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing. He talks about Newell's role both in setting up the computer science department at CMU and in setting up the psychology department, and that because of his expertise in the two, he was brought to Xerox PARC to help them decide what the goals of PARC should be. So he was consulted about its research program, PARC's research program, and he proposed that they apply psychological theory to human-computer interaction to improve the design of computer interfaces. Well, yeah, what could be wrong with that? Cognitive psychology and computer science, 1960, 1970, I would argue. What's wrong with it is it's the science of a middle-aged white man sitting at a computer thinking through a math problem alone by himself. That's what Lick was pushing us to look at. That's what the man-machine symbiosis was about. It's what Simon and Newell's goals were to think about the improvement of tightly defined processes and their application to the design of technology, and technology used to improve narrowly defined cognitive processes. So I'm saying, contrary to that, that we can replace each of those items. That today in our HCI, middle-aged white men are not our only design. Okay, I'll speak for myself. Middle-aged white men are not the only community that I design for. That I try and be more broad in my conception of ethnicity, of culture, of race, of gender, and of age. And I'm not going to have time to talk about this today, but I've been thinking a lot about the cognitive architectures that came out of that era and whose cognition they are. Like, who is SOAR? You know, it's a generalized cognitive architecture. Whose generalized cognition? But I'll leave that alone for the moment. So here's this guy sitting at a computer. What is a computer? Clearly, our computer differs from theirs, but it differs even more than they might ever have dreamed. Computers are embedded into fabric, into toys, into phones, into clouds. You can get grants to study computing clouds. So computer has a different meaning. Thinking about a math problem. It has taken the longest time for the goal of cognitive psychology and consequently the goal of HCI to be anything other than problem solving. But today we have an HCI that can look at the problem of feeling, of sensing, emotions, taste, smell, moralizing, making relationships with other people, breaking relationships with other people. The tasks that science attacked, such as math problems, today we look at telling stories, learning to read, finding friends, saving the world. The task is no longer improving our ability to compute. And we no longer think that the computer is to help a single person. We no longer think that the unit of analysis, and this is a much larger point, is the individual, either necessarily in cognitive psychology or, I'm arguing, in HCI. So our units of analysis should not be individual computers. They should be dyads, neurons, societies, and each of those units of analysis is going to push us further, I think, into a stronger HCI. So today's talk is going to be about different tasks, different populations, different computers, different units of analysis, and different human abilities. And to do this, I had to very artificially choose projects of mine that represented each of these. And there are lots of projects, of course, and I had to choose one, and every single project is a whole talk. So I apologize, first of all, for speaking so fast so that I can get through all of those, and second of all, for not giving any of them their fair due. You're welcome to ask questions about the projects, but if I think we're getting off track from the overall claim, or I think we're only going to get through project number 1, then I might ask you to save your question. So I think that the outcome of this reanalysis of populations, tasks, computers, I haven't memorized this, tasks, populations, computers, units of analysis, and human abilities is going to be a stronger, broader, deeper HCI that's going to give us as its products a deep knowledge of how people play, how they work, how they learn, alone, in collaboration with others, with and without technological mediation, and a deep ability to design technologies where design means knowing people's ability to learn, build, dream, live, etc. Technologies that support thinking, feeling, and relating, both to other people and with technology. Okay, so now I'm going to go through them one by one. And I just put these arrows because in each case, of course, as I've tried to break this down over my career, I have not just done one project that shows that the task is not just math problems. So when I was at Stanford a couple of years ago, I talked about some work I've been doing on direction giving, and this is actually work I started because of conversations with Barbara Tversky on the role of gesture in direction giving. I've done a lot of work on storytelling, and you're going to see some of that. And I've done some work on just getting along, mere and sheer co-presence, or phatic communion, as Malinowski called it. And that's work that came from my computational linguistics work on dialogue systems. So for a very long time, I've been working on natural language generation and dialogue systems that support natural language generation. This is a fairly classic architecture for a dialogue system. My own innovation has been really only two things. One, that the system react reactively without first reflecting to a certain number of behaviors, coming from the insight that when we have a conversation with somebody else, we nod before we have time to process what we've heard. And so that reactive nod doesn't play the role of marking our understanding, but of something else. That's been the first innovation I've brought to these architectures. And the second has been the ability to treat nonverbal behavior on a par with verbal behavior, to generate gesture, eye gaze, and posture shifts, as well as words and phrases as ways of moving the dialogue forward. That was all well and good until one day, one of my students pointed out to me that we were always throwing away the first 3 to 4 minutes of our data as we designed these architectures based on a study of how people talk and gesture and use their heads. And I would always say, trim away the beginning, trim away the beginning. And he said, you know, you're always telling us look closely, look deeply. What's in the beginning? And I said, oh, you know, they're just getting used to the tape recorder or the video recorder. Nothing interesting is happening. Which smart graduate student that he was, he did not take as a sufficient answer, and he went back and looked. And this started us on a 6-month study of small talk, which is exactly what people do during the section that you trim of your dialogues when you're looking at tasks. We decided that we would get more information by following a realtor around, because if you've ever worked with a realtor, you know that they are masters of small talk, and they have to be, because they're selling million-dollar objects. And million-dollar objects take a fair amount of trust. And our hypothesis was, once we started looking at trimmed piece after trimmed piece, that small talk was serving a particular role in trust. And in fact, we looked at a lot of data, not just from her, but from other realtors, and also eyeglass salesmen, because we figured that would be a nice contrast case, because they're selling $2.95 artifacts. What's the difference between their use of small talk to somebody who's selling $1 million artifact? What it led us to do was to say that a dialogue system should not just have an interpretation of what the person says, but a relational model of the relationship between two people, or in our case, between the agent and the person. That relational model has to have an assessment of the relationship between the two along dimensions such as familiarity, solidarity, power, and affect. And that relationship model is sent to the dialogue planner, the discourse planner, to plan certain kinds of conversational moves that also serve the agent's goals, but that are done through small talk as well as task talk. So conversational moves are directly coming from an understanding of the relationship between the two people, as well as the task goals of the conversation, such as to sell a house. Okay, so this is really just an example of what happens when you change your task, when the task is no longer just to put a flywheel together or to sell a house, but where the task might be to have a conversation. What does the task of having a conversation look like? And really, the moral is that even though I had spent years looking at people collaborating, I was able to ignore the first minutes of their talk because my notion of talk was defined by the social science that I lived by. And new theories, social psychology, ethnomethodology, pushed me to starting looking more closely. Okay, you can see how fast we're going to go. This should give you a sign. Okay, so that's task. Let's move on to populations. Really, for many, many years, we built tools for us. We built interfaces for people like ourselves. And it took a pretty long time, but there was a day when people started looking around and saying the tools that I'm building for me and my fellow computer science graduate students are not going to be equally appreciated by everybody in the world. What do? Well, in my own work, I spent a number of years looking at girls in computer science, women in computer science, girls using video games as a way of getting access into the relationship between girls and technology. I've looked at online communities in the developing world, and I've looked at language use and cultural identity, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is the hardest topic I have ever worked on. This is just an introduction for you. It's hard to talk about, it's hard to do, and it's actually one of the things that I'm doing at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, is trying to be more sophisticated in my understanding of language use and cultural identity. So let me give you the backstory. For a number of years, I've been working on storytelling. And for the second half of those years, I've been interested in the role that storytelling plays, not just to make us happy and to fulfill cultural goals, but also to fulfill learning goals. What's the role of storytelling in literacy, for example? And storytelling plays a really big role in literacy for little kids. Little kids practice literacy behaviors. They practice the things that are going to be essential for reading and writing in everyday storytelling, especially with their peers. And it helps them when they get to school. One group, however, is not helped by these behaviors when they get to school. And that is African American children, for whom there is still a huge gap between their performance and the performance of white kids. It's actually extraordinary that in 2008 we can still point to an achievement gap such as the following, that only 12% of African American fourth graders reach the level proficient, which is the mid-level on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And 61% don't even reach basic, which is the lowest level. As the kids get older, the achievement gap widens. How can this possibly be in our schools? It's unbelievable. And the kinds of things, okay, short political statement, caveat in advance. How can it possibly be that the solutions that are proposed are things like No Child Left Behind, which is a way of punishing teachers for putting energy into the classroom in ways that don't teach to the test. The test over the past few years has become so important that they can now show a reduced achievement gap in 2nd grade and a worse achievement gap in 4th grade. The kids study so closely to the test in 1st and 2nd grade that they fall off a cliff when they get to 4th and 5th grade, and their performance plummets. Because as you remember, in 4th and 5th grade, you actually have to think for yourselves. It's not John goes to the blank. And these kids can't do that because they've been taught to the test. In particular, and interestingly, use of dialect in the schools seems to be negatively correlated with performance. And what I mean by dialect is Appalachian English, African American Vernacular English, Southern English, Spanglish, any dialect that children might speak at home that is not the standard code used by teachers. And here, let me just point something out. In education, it's common to talk about standard American English as the English that's used in the classroom. No single person speaks standard American English. It's a theoretical fiction to describe the Englishes that are high status as opposed to the Englishes that are not high status, like African American Vernacular English. You can tell that that's what's going on because for middle-class black kids who come to school speaking African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, at the beginning of 1st grade, they speak AAVE. At the end of 1st grade, they speak less AAVE in the classroom. For poor black kids who come to school, at the beginning of 1st grade, they speak AAVE. At the end of 1st grade, they speak more AAVE. Why do you think it's the case? This is one of these wonderful things where culture just comes barreling into educational practice. It's been argued that it's the case because the middle-class kids are saying, okay, I get it. Academic success, SAE, Standard American English. I can do that. I've seen examples of academic success around me at home. And the poor kids are saying, academic success equals Standard American English. Academic success, I haven't seen any examples of it in people who are like me. I'm not likely to get any of that. I might as well get the good stuff that comes with being a part of my cultural context. And so they heighten the use of markers that, identity markers that mark them as part of the African American community. Okay, so I'm not the only person who's become interested in whether technology can play a role in diminishing the achievement gap. There's been a fair amount of work recently in what's called cultural modeling. And I'm just going to show you work in cultural modeling from the field called pedagogical agents, where virtual humans are used as tutors. And I hardly ever say bad things about other people's work, so I won't say it explicitly. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. So here's some cultural modeling work. This comes from a paper by Moreno et al. These are 4 pedagogical agents. They are math tutors. And college students were given the opportunity to work with each of these tutors. Then they were asked which one they liked best, and then they were tested. I think they were tested after each tutoring session to see which one they learned with. Well, they preferred to learn from a tutor of the same gender and race. They only actually learned from the white male. I love this. You could not make this up. This is a great result. So what's going on? Why is that the case? I wish I could leave this up while maybe I'll just leave this up for a couple of minutes while I ask you the questions from the next slide. Are these depictions of math tutors? Are these 4 depictions of math tutors? Would you pick them out as math tutors in a crowd? Are the stereotypes of gender? I love the girl with the flaky smile. And actually, there's other research that looks at girls at engineering tutors and you can choose between one with a short skirt and one with a long skirt and a buttoned-up shirt. And the college students choose the short skirt, but they only, once again, learn from the white male. Now, why is that? Because our stereotypes of gender and of race carry beliefs about race and about gender, but also about ability. And these images are representations of somebody's stereotypes of what it means to be a black man, what it means to be a white woman. And they are not necessarily stereotypes that are going to help people learn from somebody of their own gender or race. How do we understand identity in a more sophisticated way? How do we understand the identity of woman or black, or the identity of math tutor as something that you construct? When I was a first-year faculty member, I was terrified, of course, as many people are, that quickly someone was going to find out that I didn't know what I was doing. And so every morning, I would stare at my closet and think, which are the professor clothes? I've got to get professor clothes. And I was obsessed with this for months because I didn't feel like a professor. So I figured if I could put professor on, both my students and I would be fooled into thinking that I knew something that I could teach them. Identity is made that way. We are all, in some sense, putting on parts of identity. This is the performative theory of identity. Yeah, Barbara.
So since you invited questions, I'm going to put forth that study was horribly confounded. And that if the white male had looked like a dork with a baseball cap, you wouldn't have thought you could learn that from him.
Right.
So
exactly.
It's really...
Oh, it's a terrible study along 43 different dimensions. Okay. Yeah. No. Far be it for me to say, let's do work like this. I hope I'm not saying that.
Conclusions that about white men as opposed to...
But it's drawing... No. The conclusions that it's drawing are about computer scientists trying to represent cultural diversity. Or that's the conclusions that I'm drawing. What happens when you let people loose on a topic when they don't know anything about social psychology? This is really, in case that wasn't clear, that's my point. That unless you know about identity, unless you know about stereotypes and schemata, you're going to make terrible design decisions that are going to have influences on your final product. So thank you for bringing that up so I can make that a lot more clear. Yeah. So how do we understand things in a lot more sophisticated way? How do we draw on social psychology, for example, to understand identity? How do we draw on the new cultural psychology, of which Stanford actually has some stellar practitioners, to understand identity as something that's constructed in the moment between two people or many people? And how can we draw from that understanding to make interfaces that do have an effect on learning? So this is what my students and I are doing. We've looked at all the different axes that go into identity construction. How we dress, so professor dress, jewelry, gold chains, hairstyle. Once again, when I was a graduate student and I was on the market and I had an interview and I was coming down in the elevator. I was at the Linguistics Society of America meetings and I ran into Livia Polanyi and she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm on my way to an interview." And she said, "You march right back upstairs and put your hair in a bun. You are not going to an interview with your hair down," which is why, by the way, I give talks with my hair down now because I have a job. She said, "You're going to confuse them. You don't look like a serious scholar." All of these things go into how people see us and how we present ourselves. Language use and the movement of our body also goes into these topics. And these are the ones that my students and I have chosen to look at because we think that the visual, superficial features of identity construction are far too likely to lead to unwanted, stereotypical inferences. So what we've been looking at is African American Vernacular English, and sometimes I call it AAVE and sometimes I call it AAE, African American English, but it's the same thing. AAVE is a dialect of English. It is a perfectly coherent dialect. It has a syntax and a semantics, a morphology and a phonology that is perfectly consistent. There are different subdialects across the United States, and the one I've been looking at is the Chicago dialect that comes from a migration from the South in the 1920s. So in AV, we find people substituting f for th, or the for v, so with or bathe instead of with or bathe. There's deletion of the copula, or the auxiliary verb, like he hungry instead of he is hungry. Subject-verb agreement is always third-person singular. They was looking for the big dog instead of they were looking. Habitual be, he be getting some ice cream. The appositive pronoun, my mama, she took me to school. A really interesting one, AV has what's called a proximal future, which many other languages have, but standard American English doesn't have. Like, je vais aller in French means I'm going to go, but in a closer future than j'irai. Well, AV has that proximal future. Fitna. I fitna go is I'm about to go. In some dialects, it's supposita or abouta. And fitna apparently comes from fixing to, but that's under discussion. Okay, so there are a lot of features of AV that allow us to recognize it as AV. And the history of AV is part of how we think of it as a dialect and how we think of it, of its role in our society. AV comes from the creolization of English. That is, the mixture of the languages that slaves spoke so that they could speak to one another. But by many people still today, it's considered to just be bad English. And in case you think that's an old-fashioned view, my students and I have just been thrown out of our 11th school district in Chicago, our 11th school, because, as the principal said, there is no way they are going to allow people in who are going to speak bad English to their children. So this view of AV as bad English is still very much in place. So AV has little prestige in the world of education, where it's considered to represent ignorance and poverty, and it encourages discrimination. I put this note here because teachers may not like it, but hip-hop singers, white, black, or Latino, do use it. So we see there's actually been a number of papers on this recently about white kids using AV as a way of marking their high status in urban communities. That should make it clear that not all African Americans use AV. And actually, I have a friend who also works on this topic who said to me, it's so ironic. I spent my childhood having AV beaten out of me by my mother, and now I'm spending my adulthood trying to understand how children can use AV at home and use SAE at school. So not all African Americans use AV. Not all African Americans use AV in all contexts. Oprah Winfrey, for example, does a stellar job of using AV when she's marking being one of the people. It's really interesting how she code switches back and forth. African Americans are not the only ones to use AV. But the vast majority of African Americans can use AV or do use AV to signal identity. How do we understand enough about this so that we can use AV, both verbal and nonverbal aspects of it, to design really culturally diverse interfaces? The way we did it was the way we do everything. We look closely. So we've spent a couple of years now studying children in spontaneous conversation without anybody else in the room. Let me show you an example. And I've got the transcription in case it's hard to hear.
I can do it myself. Girl, leave my friend alone, brother. I ain't doing, I'm not fixing mine. But y'all keep it down there. Somebody's trying to sleep here. I hope you know you remember that you got a microphone on you. Yeah. Remember this on our shirts? She can't you don't even know what we do. But she could tape it down. What is this? You drinking in the house? Oh, you refrigerator. Give me my refrigerator. Here you go. Give me my chip.
Okay, so We have a lot of dialogues like this that we've been studying. They are a stellar way of looking at, first of all, children's use of narrative, which is masterful. These kids go back and forth between the narrative of their daily lives. Remember, you got a microphone on you. To the narrative of a mom and a dad. Oh, are you drinking in the house again? Back and forth from that seamlessly. How do they do that? How do they know which role they're playing at a given moment? Well, we characterize our videos, probably 30 or 40 videos like this, in terms of the verbal characteristics, the repetition of one another, duh, la, the sing-song nature of it, the movement back and forth from a character to a narrator, the nonverbal aspects, the eye roll, disagreeing pout, sass, what's been called the suck teeth, which is a specific African-American gesture, Parataxis, that is putting two utterances together without any connection between them, interruption, simultaneous talk. And this allows us to build a model of how children tell stories together in this particular community. And we have exactly the same kind of model for lower and middle class white kids that we compare this to. The next step is to build an agent where the identity, as I told you, does not contain unwanted inferences or stereotypes. How do we do that? Well, we did this kind of weird thing. We worked really hard to build a race-ambiguous character. And we did that by working with an animator who drew a character, and then we showed it to kids, and we said, white or black. Basically, what we really said was, tell us a story about this character. Which of these two families would take the character home, white family or black family? What's the character's name? Is it like anybody you know? Kind of sideways questions to get at their understanding of its race. And we kept changing it until half the kids thought it was black and half the kids thought it was white. So we know that it doesn't have a fixed racial status. That's the character that we then tweak to be either African American or white by giving it the speech and nonverbal behavior that we derived from our study of the kids, from those two models. So one same character so that we don't have a confound in terms of appearance, two models of behavior. And the question is, do kids recognize it as being their same ethnicity, and do they learn from it? Okay, so first of all, let me show you what it's like to have a kid interact with a virtual child speaking African-American vernacular English.
When Keisha went back to her house, she told her mom that everybody liked her show and tell. Everyone was happy and they ate macaroni and cheese. The end.
That was a good story, Alex.
Your turn.
So, once upon a time, there was a beautiful young lady named Anaja, which is me. She was a princess, and she was waiting to find her man of her dreams. But her mother said, Mom, I don't want to be your son anymore.
Okay, let me show you another one.
I bet you guys are hungry. Don't you want to go do something? So he took off his coat, and then they all played together, and they sang, oh, happy days, oh, happy days. It isn't wrong. When they got done, it was like this. It was nighttime, okay, Alex? Did you get mine? Then it switched to morning.
Okay, this is just in case you thought kids don't get engaged in playing with something that's just a cartoon on a screen. Would you agree that they're a little bit engaged? Okay, so the real question is, what do they think it is in terms of identity? We looked at it a number of different ways. We asked them which family would take the character home, and we found that the agent that spoke standard American English was almost always we were told that it was taken home by the white family. But the black agent, the agent that spoke AAVE, we were only told that it was taken home by the African American family 56% of the time. So we've clearly got a way to go before it's perceived as an African American agent. On the other hand, we found something really interesting. The agent that speaks a dialect other than theirs is the one that they imitate. So significantly more frequently, they imitate the talk of the SAE agent. Not only do they imitate it, but they themselves use standard American English when talking to it. So if our ultimate goal is to help these kids understand that AAVE is a great dialect, it's good, there's nothing wrong with it, it gets used at home, and standard American English is the language of the school, there seems to be a wedge into that because the kids do imitate what the SAE agent says. And in fact, what we're doing now, what we call the rinse and repeat cycle of our research, is we're going back and looking at another task. We're looking at a science task because we also want to look at standard science talk and how children understand what it means to be a good scientist in a classroom, what the right way of talking about science is. So we're having kids build a bridge together, and then we're telling them that they're going to have to go back into the classroom and tell the teacher what they did. And what we find is that when we say that, one of the kids says, oh, I'll be the teacher. Tell me, this is a kid who's spoken AAVE every moment up until then. Okay, tell me what you did. Explain to me. So they may be speaking AAVE most of the time, but they have an understanding of what teacher talk is. And this is what we're going to use as the bridge into understanding the context of the two dialect. And that, by the way, is our new agent, which I like a lot better than the previous one. We just, we're using a different software for doing, a whole different system for doing computer graphics. We're using the Smart Body from USC, and it allows us to make a lot prettier agents. Okay, so the implications of this are you can just draw ideas from your own head about what race or gender are. But you're likely to draw ideas from your own head that you don't even know you have. And those are unwanted inferences in the interface. But sensitive interface design can come from a deep understanding of how communities index identity. And in turn, interestingly, those same interfaces allow us to investigate social science questions that other people have been not able to get to. Because it's really hard. Well, the IRB has never yet allowed me to stick electrodes into a child's brain so that I can control the child at a distance. And so I'm obliged to make virtual children whom I can control to find out how children interact with particular kinds of language. I may be able to get through one more, maybe. So computers, what is a computer? And this I think I'm going to go through really quickly because you guys know exactly what this is. You haven't been working on keyboards, screens, and a mouse for a decade. But when I first started doing work on storytelling, I used to get a lot of visits from toy companies. And they used to say, oh, the stuff you're doing is really cool. We could put Disney stories into the interface you're building. And I kept saying, okay, so what's the interface going to do? Well, the kid will sit down and the toy will tell it a story. And then it'll tell it, math problems. And then it'll tell it answers. And this tell it, we started to make a joke, my students and I, that the tell it was what computers did to children. You just have to imagine a kid as a pumpkin. And the computer gets poured into the funnel, into the pumpkin, so that the kid gets smarter. On the contrary, our belief about this was that computers should listen to it. That's all they should do. They should listen to children. And by listening, allow children to experiment with hypotheses about the world, about language, and so forth. This is work that I did with Mike Anany, who's, I think, a last-year graduate student, I hope, a last-year graduate student in COM here at Stanford. And it's a beautiful project. It was actually made into a product that went to market. It's called Telltale, although I always call it the story worm. It's a way of thinking about how toys can allow children to talk, but in talking to gain a greater understanding of how talk works. So the idea is that each of these body pieces is a recording device. It holds 60 seconds of audio. In the initial prototypes, we couldn't figure out quite what the relationship between the pieces of the audio would be. But in our final version, we found a way so that each piece could record 60 seconds of audio, and when you pushed the nose, you got all the audio all the way through the body. And when you switched the order of the pieces, you got a different story all the way through. So kids could record pieces of stories, mix and match, and think about segmentation, which is what we were interested in for the age group we were looking at. How do children understand events in stories? How do they understand the connectives between pieces of talk? So we ran a couple of studies where we compared children playing with the telltale, where each piece had 60 seconds of audio and you could move them around and change the order, with one big telltale, one big tell head that had the same amount of audio total, but there wasn't a segmentation. And what we found was that when kids used the segmented telltale, they were more likely to use conjunctions, those words that link pieces of talk, like and then, or later on, or however, than when they used the single piece. And when they were using the larger piece, they were less likely to make false starts. They were more likely to say, once upon a time there was a boy, next piece, and he went to school. And at school they studied math. Whereas with the big piece they would say, once upon a time there was a So they were getting, once again, this notion of segmentation. This was really interesting to us because this is a hard thing for this particular age. This is the role of this interface as educational technology. But it also allowed us to look at a problem in developmental psycholinguistics, which is a puzzle about SES, socioeconomic status, and school talk. It is often said that poor kids don't know how to behave well in school. They're always interrupting. And this is not a study about race in this instance. This was work that we did in Dublin. All of the kids were white. Some were high SES, wealthy kids, and some were low SES, poor kids. What we found was that both groups told stories that were as long. But the high SES kids were more likely to use those connectives that teachers like so much, both at the beginning and at the end. However, unexpectedly, the low SES kids were just as coherent. But their coherence came from this phenomenon called Parataxis. They actually, when they were taking turns telling pieces of a story, talked at exactly the same time, and yet the pieces of the story cohered. So somehow they were able to multitask or to parallel process so that they could hear what the other kids said and they could say their own piece at the same time, and the coherence was identical. The implications are, when you understand the kinds of challenges that pre-literate children face, from watching them tell stories, from understanding what the continuation is from oral storytelling to school literacy, you can design interfaces that actually target particular problems in what they're doing. And that those same interfaces allow us to conduct studies of children's pre-literacy behavior that are otherwise hard to do. This ends at 2, does it? Yeah. I think I'm going to very briefly, I have a choice here. I have 2 more projects I was going to tell you about. One is about online communities, and one is about children with autism. Got a
quick version.
Okay. So this is actually what I'm supposed to be doing this year, is this project on a community called the Junior Summit. It's a community that I launched in 1998. It had 3,062 kids as a part of it. And they were from 139 countries, which is a lot of different countries. We were interested in questions having to do with civic participation, being a member of a global society. We had read a lot of literature that told us how bad the internet was going to be for community, how bad it was going to be for democracy, how bad it was going to be for civic participation. Like this, it's the only technology powerful enough to challenge and mutate our disintegrating collective vision of community. the internet inherently denies and denigrates the crux of direct democratic theory. Obama does not buy into this, clearly, and he's good, and a good thing too. So in our work, we were contrasting the internet is evil argument with the internet is a site for civic involvement and self-efficacy, development of the belief that you can be an agent of change in your environment. As I said, we had 3,000 kids, 3,062 kids from 139 countries. I have to say that I didn't even know the names of some of these countries before the kids sent in their requests. We got these kids by sending out 50,000 calls for applications in 26 different languages. We sent them to every Ministry of Education in the world and every secondary school principal in the world. We sent them to every non-governmental organization that had access to children in the world, and that was on the internet. This was a lot easier in 1997 when we started this, because there were a lot fewer of these organizations online. But we really blanketed the world with calls for proposals. And kids wrote in and told us how they thought technology could make the world better for young people, and if they didn't know what technology was, how community could make the world better for young people. We built a dorky little machine translation engine. I say dorky because as bad as machine translation is now, it was even worse then. And our own layer on top of that, the middleware that we built, basically allowed the software to gist what a particular kid had said in a particular language and send it to another kid who was part of a translation board, who would then translate it into something comprehensible and send it on to the kid who was going to read it. So it was a good computer plus human solution. The kids were really, really different kinds of kids. There were wealthy kids, like this kid from Singapore with a lovely house and a lovely backyard. There were poor kids, like this girl from Bangladesh. You would be able to see her home, except that it's underwater in the picture to her right, and you can see somebody on a raft coming from that section of Dhaka where he's gone to get something from a house that's underwater. And a large segment of Dhaka is underwater for part of each year. And then there are places that are just even hard to imagine, like the smallest self-governing nation in the world and my favorite country in the world, Niue, which has a population of 536 families in the entire country. The rest of them are off the rock, as it's called. It's a really amazing place. This is a picnic. The drinks are coconuts. And that picture at the top of the boat is a very significant picture because it was the first time for 3 months that a boat had been able to come in. And that meant that the only thing you could buy in the store was dry crackers. Everything else had been bought. And so there was a lot of taro on the menu everywhere. A really extraordinary place. And these are the kinds of kids who participated. The web interface was simple. We built our own browser to respond to the desires of parents in terms of safety. Okay, and the data for what I'm looking at now is all messages written during the first 3 months of the forum. We're actually adding more messages over time, but for the moment I've been looking at the first 3 months, which is 48,000 email messages. What any kid wrote to any kid, plus semi-structured interviews that I carried out with a research assistant, who happens to be Donna Tversky, who's now in medical school here at Stanford, actually, who's in a residency after medical school. And we carried out 78 interviews. The interviews lasted anywhere from 3 to 7 hours. And so we have more than 900 pages of interview data. And we also have questionnaires that the kids filled out that concern their belief about changing their world, their belief about self-worth, about social networks. And these are the things we're looking at. I'm going to briefly show you just a couple of random results just to show you what you can do with data like this as opposed to make particular points. One of the things we were interested in was the kids got online. We told them, you're the Junior Summit community. What does building community mean? There's been a lot of talk about this for online communities, but no one has really looked at, once again, the devices, the moment-to-moment use of language, which is what online communities are, to construct community. So we looked at a very simple thing. Community might be represented by the word we, as opposed to individual, which is represented by the word I. And what we found was, in fact, the word I goes down over the first 3 months of the summit, and the word we goes up. There's a problem with that. Actually, there are two problems with that. One is, it's possible that we means we here in my country in Niue. So we looked at that. We got a random sample of 300 utterances that had we in them, and the vast majority meant we here on the forum. What's the second possibility? The second possibility is there were a bunch of I-focused kids, and they just figured out that this wasn't the place for them, and so they left. And that's what you're seeing right there, is those kids saying, I'm out of here. But in fact, there was attrition, but even despite attrition, exactly this pattern holds. So the same kids are coming to say we to refer to this new group that they're a part of. Likewise, not only are they using we to refer to the group, but they're coming to talk like each other. And there are lots of instances of that. This is one of this kind of entrainment. Girls were more likely to use positive emotion words early in the forum. By week 5 actually, the boys were just as likely to use these positive emotion words as the girls were. Interestingly and unexpectedly, girls ruled in this forum. The boys came to talk like the girls were more likely to be elected leaders, the girls' style of talk was adopted. As you can see in these analyses, we looked to see what predicted which of the kids were elected as leaders of the online community. And by leader, I mean the fact that the kids were told that 100 of them would get an all-expenses-paid trip to Boston, where they would talk to world leaders about their ideas. Fairly desirable. So the kids could vote. They set up the voting. There was only one vote. They gamed that a tiny little bit. They only gamed it by not voting because they figured that they would be more likely to win if they didn't vote. But other than that, it was a fairly straightforward election. And what we found was, as I said, more girls were elected than boys. But more interestingly, what got boys elected was different than what got girls elected. So for girls, if they synthesized the language of the people around them, that really didn't make a difference. If boys synthesized the language of the group, if they said, John has a great idea about using computers in poor schools, and Jane added to that that we can use solar power in those computers, that shot them up to delegate status. Empathetic language, on the other hand, worked for boys and didn't work for girls. Girls were less likely, significantly less likely, to be elected if they were empathetic. And the same thing for tentative language. What's interesting about these is that all three are the kinds of things that we think of as girls doing. So the sensitive boys got elected, and the less sensitive girls got elected to leadership status. I'm going to skip over this. What I'm doing this year is I'm looking at self-efficacy, the belief that you can be an agent of change in your environment and globally. It's something that I think is really important for children who grow up in contexts where that's not a given, where they are not the kinds of kids who think, I can get good grades and go to a good college, where they think that they cannot make change. Is there evidence in the ways that these kids talk that might demonstrate that something like this helps kids acquire a sense of self-efficacy? And what's interesting when you look at them is some of the kids get really self-efficacious, and some of the kids are actually a little bit more realistic. And they say things like, in the beginning, I was really naive, like I thought anything could be done. And then I started talking to world leaders, and you know what? It was harder than I thought. And those kids are just as interesting because they're actually finding out how the world works. Okay, I'm going to skip over the moderation. It's a small point, and really the point of it is that we think we know what's good for kids. We think that if we leave kids alone in an online community, it's going to be, as everyone tells me, the Lord of the Flies. On the contrary, if we leave kids alone, they construct ideas. If we stick adults in, they stop speaking, and the moderators start speaking. So, implications of this. Knee-jerk approaches to controlling young people may lead to dysfunctional communities. Kids on their own do well. And the design decisions that we make in designing communities both play a role and allow us to uncover these results. I think rather than showing you the autism work, I'm going to stop here and make sure that you get your questions answered. And then if there's time, I'll go into this. So I will skip to the end. I can come back to this. Oop. So the methodology that I've been showing you is this methodology of first starting by looking at kids or adults, understanding what happens when people are alone in the absence of technology, trying to understand that in a deep enough way that we can theorize about it, model it, and use that as the basis for an implementation. And then take that back to the more classic human factors analysis, and then the rinse and repeat cycle, because we've always made huge boo-boos, we haven't understood something, and we go back to natural data in a repeating cycle of social science, design, implementation, evaluation, social science. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Yeah, Barbara.
So those were all really interesting cases, and I'm sorry there wasn't time for even more. I'm wondering, do you start with observing a situation? Do you start with time? Right? Because it somehow would be easier, I think, to start with the tool and then look at the situation where it might be just a vague where if then you see what kind of context, how might it be used, how might it be appropriate for a situation. Yeah, but it almost felt like you were starting with
and I do, actually. I start with the situation. And I think this is the intuition of a designer, in a sense. This is the thing that you learn as you spend more time in a field, is what the interesting problems are. I don't start by saying, I'm going to build a literacy tool. Let me look at how children use language in the service of literacy. My subsequent designs in the literacy area might look at that. But the first design doesn't. And actually, Dave Kelsey has written about this in a beautiful way, that there's a big difference between initial designs and subsequent designs. The initial design is really a hunch about a problem that's been understudied. And to be absolutely truthful about it, I love storytelling. I think it's really cool, really interesting, and a really important part of society. And when I started looking at it in 1995, it was forbidden in computer science. Now we have a narrative tradition. Then it was totally under the radar. And I was telling Terry that the first time I gave a talk in this class 10 years ago, I snuck some stuff from my narrative work in, which otherwise I never spoke about. I studied it because I loved it, and I thought it was important, and I thought it needed to be studied. Once I hate to admit this, but it is actually true. Once I started looking for funding, then I started thinking about the links between narrative and literacy, because there was no way in those days I was going to get funding to study storytelling. Storytelling had to do something. Play was not okay. Learning was okay. And that's when I started looking at the links with literacy, and luckily there were really interesting areas in literacy that I became passionate about for their own sake. But I start with the situation.
So that's even more radical than you describe.
Maybe, yeah. Thanks.
So in your initial discussion, you posited the white man sitting there and there was kind of a, coherent may be a strong word, but a development of an interrelated body of theories that sort of pull together that view of cognitive processing.
Right.
You have some sort of correlate. What is the thing that pulls together your...
Yeah. This is a great question, and if I live long enough, I'll have an answer to it. Because I know that I no longer believe in the strict, narrow information processing version of cognitive psychology that was the birth of all of this. I know that on the one hand. On the other hand, I know that increasingly I go to cultural psychology and ethnomethodology and ethnographic approaches and conversational analysis approaches, all of which are very much about the moment-to-moment performance of social practices or our identity in social practice. How to make a coherent story about tasks, populations, computers. Obviously, I don't have a coherent story. I can never remember the 5 of them. But that's exactly what I'm working on. That's exactly what I'd like to come up with, because I think it could be the cornerstone for a new way of teaching students to do this. But I have only, you can see there, you can see something and you know it's there, but you're not there yet. That's where I am. Yep.
Early on, you used the word replace a fair amount, such as replacing cognitive psychology with more socially oriented. And once upon a time, cognitive psychology was thought of in terms of replacing the micro human factors kinds of research.
Right.
I'm wondering whether, in fact, this isn't a case of increasing scope
Yes.
rather than replacing.
Yes. At one point, the title for this talk had the word hermeneutic in it, but it had the word hermeneutic in it, but then I decided that, yeah, that was a bad idea, I decided. But it's really, what I'm really talking about is a hermeneutic spiral back through the early days of HCI, but enlarging the focus of that psychology. And of course, there are psychologists doing exactly the same thing, which is what makes this interesting. So,
Any chance it's a layering in the same sense that we have layers of computer architectures or network architectures where each can call upon the other?
right. I thought about that when I was trying to think about the units of analysis. Do we look at neurons, and the neurons make up individuals, and the individuals make up dyads? But in fact, as I tried to put those different aspects of my work together, I realized that there's usually a strong tension amongst them, as opposed to one drawing on the next. And so that didn't work. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, maybe this is going to your parts categorization, and
Yeah.
with respect to the way it might drive a research program. Kind of very, very literally sort of constructing a matrix there, 5 categories, somewhere around at least half a dozen category concerns. What will unify a research center-like program? Keep coherent.
Right. Right. The coherence comes from a couple of axes. One is look closely. Now, look closely is a methodology, and it's rare that we unify our research programs in terms of a methodology, although people are always criticizing psychology for that. I mean, it's everyone says the only thing that holds psychologists together is that they all believe in statistics. So in a sense, maybe a methodology is not such a bad way. But the methodology on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the notion of the units of analysis is extremely important to me. So in my own work, it's not just that I think there is the individual, the dyad. It's that the notion of a dyadic analysis has come to seem essential to me. So I'm spending a lot of time these days reading books on dyadic data analysis, thinking about contingency, thinking about how we move away when we think about human-computer interaction of the two of them being separate agents, which is mind-bending. I didn't talk about it because it feels so partial in my own mind, but it's the thing I'm the most passionate about is how do we build tight contingency in the interaction between the human and the computer so that they function as a dyad. We can't even do that in data analysis of 2 people yet because of the very broken and partial tools that we have for looking at the dyad as the basic unit as opposed to the individual as the basic unit. And that's because we live in a world where the individual, we live in a culture where the individual holds sway as the basic unit of analysis. And that, I think, is a second really important cornerstone, is moving, not just saying the individual is one option, but moving away from the very notion of the individual.
Okay, so let me repeat what I said at the beginning. Since Justine is here at the Behavioral Science Center for the year, or any of this, there's way more stuff behind that, as you saw. Intrigues you, the email is on the web page for the talk today, and you can get in touch and talk for more. Thanks.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.